Okay. So big picture motivation for this paper is that there's long-standing ideas in economics dating back to the likes of Chris and William, which tells us that the assignment of property rights within an economy matters, particularly in the presence of transaction costs. And in particular, there are trade-offs involved in the design of property rights in terms of how property rights affect investment incentives, how they affect the efficiency of reallocation in an economy over time. And the assignment of property rights also has implications for the distribution of market power and surplus in an economy more broadly. And in particular, it may be the case that the assignment of property rights that, say, promotes efficient investments may conflict with society's desires in terms of market power and the distribution of surplus. And so the very big picture question that we're interested in tackling in this paper is, in light of all of these trade-offs, what does the optimal design of property rights then look like? So we're going to do this in a very specific setting where we're going to think about one particular channel through which property rights affect economic outcomes. And that is, we're going to think about property rights as determining the holder's outside of options with regard to some underlying good in their economic interactions with other agents. So the property rights are essentially going to determine outcomes that an agent can unilaterally implement and that they don't have to negotiate with some other agent. So there are going to be a range of different property rights that are captured in our environment. So perhaps the most classic form of property rights that are generally studied in economics are what we would call a full property right. And this is a very simple property right. It just allows the holder to always keep the good without having any underlying obligation to any other agent. Another extreme would be an agent has no right. In this case, their outside option with respect to the ownership of this good would just be normalized to zero. Another common form of property right would be something like an option to own or a renewable lease. And this would allow the holder to have the option of keeping the good, but only if they make some pre-specified payment to some other agent in the economy. And then there are many, many other variations of property rights that have not so much been studied in the economics literature, but have been studied quite extensively in the legal literature. And so the key modeling idea in this paper is we're going to think about having a designer that does not control the allocation directly, but can influence economic interactions by designing the outside option of an agent. And this perspective is going to allow us to use mechanism design techniques to characterize optimal property rights. And our main result in the paper is then going to be that the optimal property right is very simple, but it's more flexible than a conventional full property right, and it's generally going to feature an option to own contract. So in interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the related literature, but I really just want to highlight two very broad strands of literature that have previously studied property rights in the presence of transaction costs. So the first big literature that I want to highlight is the literature that's looked at how property rights affect efficiency under private information. And the second literature that I want to highlight is this incomplete contracts literature that's sort of about how property rights affect investment incentives. Each of these previous literatures has previously recognized the attractive properties of option to own contracts. But what each of these literatures do is that they make restrictions on the contracting space that they're optimizing over. And so we can think about our paper as essentially providing a broader optimality foundation for option to own contracts. And we're going to be doing this in sort of a refreshed framework that is neither more general nor less general than each of these settings. We're going to sort of borrow modeling techniques from each of these settings without sort of superseding all of these papers. And in particular, our setting is really going to be geared towards thinking about market design applications. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the model. Initially, I'm not going to deliver on the promise at the start of the talk, in that I'm going to consider a simplified version of the model first that doesn't have investment. Okay, so our basic model then is, at this point, a completely standard contracting problem between a principal and an agent. We have some public state omega that's drawn from some distribution G. We have an agent, their private type theta is drawn from some distribution F omega. So the agent's type distribution can depend on this public state. And then the principal is going to choose a trading mechanism. This trading mechanism is going to be contingent on the realization of this public state, subject to the standard incentive compatibility and individual rationality constraints of the agent. and we're just using standard notation X here to denote allocations and T to denote transfers. So the agent has a standard quasi-linear utility format, and then we're assuming that the principal is maximizing some objective that depends on the allocation, the agent's type, the public state, and then also on their own revenue. So one natural example might be to think of the principal as just maximizing their revenue, but perhaps they have some outside option or alternative use for this good aside from assigning it to the agent that's being captured through this public state. Okay, so now this is where the twist in this completely standard model is going to come. And that is that we're going to imagine that prior to this interaction between the agent and the principal, there will be a designer, and the designer has the ability to specify property rights that the agent has, and they walk into the interaction with the principal with these property rights in hand. So the designer is going to basically choose this menu of outside options, and what this menu of outside options for the agent consists of is this arbitrary bundle of contracts, which consists of a combination of an outcome and a payment. And what we're basically imagining is that when the agent enters their interaction with the principal, they can essentially pull any contract that they like from this bundle and execute that contract in lieu of participating in this trading mechanism that's being chosen by the principal. And we're going to assume that the designer is maximizing some different payoff to the principal. So maybe a natural thing to think here is that the designer is interested in maximizing, say, social surplus. So perhaps the principal just wants to maximize their own revenue. The designer is concerned about the market power that the principal has over this agent. And so the designer can redistribute surplus from the principal to the agent through the assignment of these property rights. So just some comments about the model. Basically, the way this model is constructed is so that these rights create an outside option for the agent, and the principal must guarantee that the utility for every type is not less than the utility that they would obtain from just executing their most preferred contract from this bundle in lieu of participating in the mechanism as chosen by the principal. And so this framework is then going to capture many conventional rights, because this sort of menu of rights is something that's very, very flexible way of modeling property rights. So in particular, we capture a traditional full property right. This would just correspond to a menu item that would be 1, 0. So this is just allowing the agent to keep the good without having any obligation to the principal. Another form of property right could be a cash payment. So this would be that the principal so the agent can relinquish any claim that they have over the good, but they have to make a payment to the principal in order to do this. Another would be, say, a combination of these types of rights. We could have a property right with a resale option. So the agent could have the rights to keep the good if they wish without having to make any payment to the principal, but potentially they could force the principal to take the object back. They can sell the object back to the principal if they make some pre-specified price P. A different form would be a renewable lease or an option to own. We highlighted these earlier. That is a 1P option, where P is just representing the lease price or the price and the option to own. So this is an option that the agent can execute in order to keep the good. And then we also can have the possibility of partial rights. So these may allow the agent to just retain control over some portion of the good in the case where the good is divisible, or we can interpret it in terms of randomization, depending on what's appropriate for the application. And then we can have these very flexible menus where we can have different combinations of the agent being able to retain control over different portions of the good, and then they can pay a different price. And in particular, we would have an increasing price schedule here, where the more the agent retains control over the good, then the higher the price or the higher the transfer that has to be made to the principal. Okay, so then moving into the sort of analysis and results. This here is the main result of the paper. The main result of the paper says that it turns out that even though we're considering this very, very rich class of property rights, there actually exists an optimal menu that takes this very simple form. It just consists of a single option, and this option is an option to own at some price P that's going to be calibrated, and the price P is going to depend on the degree or the wedge in terms of the conflict between the principal and the agent. If the interests of the principal and the agent, the principal and the designer, if the designer and the principal are perfectly aligned in terms of their interests, then there'd be no need to have this price. We can just set that to be sort of sufficiently large so that the agent would never execute that. But if there's some severe conflict between what the designer wants and what the principal wants, then the designer is going to assign rights to the agent in order to shift the principal towards an outcome that the designer prefers. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the outline of the proof strategy. And the first step in proving this result is to identify that given any menu M, we can map this to an outside option function R for the agent by just constructing this reservation utility function for the agent by assuming that every type is going to execute their most preferred contract from this bundle of contracts that they've been endowed with through this menu M. And then of course, knowing that there's also a standard IR constraint here. And so every agent also needs to get a positive payoff. And so what this means is that from the perspective of the principal and solving its problem using backward induction, the principal is just solving a completely standard mechanism design problem where we have this additional constraint, which is that the utility of the agent on the equilibrium path has to be at least as great as this reservation utility function. So this is an instance of a problem from a 2000 JET paper by Julian. So Julian solves this problem using a duality approach, a weak duality approach. What we do in this paper is we need to solve these problems for the principal for every single possible convex reservation utility function R. So unlike the approach in Julian, where you essentially have to guess what set of types the outside option constraint is binding on, we want a constructive solution. We need to know exactly what the structure of the set of types where the outside option constraint binds is, so that then we can take a step back and then solve the designer's problem. So the way we do this is we develop a new solution technique to solve mechanism design problems that involve type-dependent outside options. Thank you. Don't have time to go through the details of it, but it's essentially based on Myersohnian ironing. And then from this technique, we get this very interesting result, which is that the set of types at which the outside option constraint binds actually ends up being independent of the reservation utility function R. The main consequence of this result is that we end up with a problem that is linear in this reservation utility function R, and in particular, the allocation and the transfers that are optimally chosen by the principal at time t equals to are linear in R. Taking a step back, it turns out that what this implies for the designer's problem is that the designer's problem is also linear in this reservation utility function. And so then the optimal menu ends up being just an extreme point. And in this case, what do extreme points look like? Extreme points are option to own contracts. And so all the designer has to do is then just calibrate the exact price that they need in this option to own contract in order to perfectly align, in order to, as best it can, align its own interests with those of the principal. So it's obviously a methodological connection to the paper we just saw by Dworczak here. Okay, and then in terms of delivering on the promise in the introduction, now introducing the hold-up problem. It's very straightforward once we have this machinery in place to then incorporate an investment decision on the part of the agent. And with the investment decision, then we're getting at what is a big focus in the literature on property rights and economics. The way we introduce this is that we're going to imagine that if the agent undertakes this costly investment, this is going to lead to a first order improvement. So in the sense of first order stochastic dominance in the agent's type distribution in every state. And we're going to assume that investment is costly and it occurs after the agent is assigned property rights by the designer, but before the principal selects the trading mechanism. So what this means is that the agent faces a hold-up problem. And this hold-up problem is going to create a second incentive for the principal to award the agent non-trivial property rights. So we've already seen that the that the designer may want to award the agent non-trivial property rights in order to alleviate this mismatch between the preferences of the designer and the principal. But now there's also this hold-up problem. And so in order to induce the agent to invest, the designer now may also want to award the agent additional property rights in order to ensure that investment is induced. And then we have our second result of the paper, which says that now with this hold-up problem, there exists an optimal mechanism that takes still a very simple form, but now we have the addition of this partial property right beyond just the option to own contract. We now have this second partial property right, which is saying that for a lower price, the agent can retain a proportion of the resource. And the basic idea of the basic sort of mechanics here is that we've already seen that the option to own contract is the optimal way to address the mismatch of preferences between the designer and the principal. And the designer may get lucky and find that the agent's investment obedience constraint is slack under its preferred option to own contract. And in that case, it's great. The designer doesn't need to award the agent any additional rights. But if the agent's investment obedience constraint is violated at that option to own contract, then what the designer has to do is they have to add in this second option into the menu. And they're going to have to then adjust also the price in the option to own contract to accommodate the fact that there exists this second option in the menu. And the proof of this result is very straightforward. The agent's investment obedience constraint is also, it turns out, linear in this outside option function R. And so that means that the optimal menu is essentially consisting of a convex combination of two extreme points. And that's where these two item menus then come from. So just to sort of get towards the wrapping up and the conclusion. So I've given you sort of an idea of the kind of technical sort of apparatus and machinery in the paper. The sort of general framework that we have is extremely abstract. The reason why it's extremely abstract is because it's geared towards being able to capture a range of different applications. The first application that we look at is sort of dynamic resource allocation. That's perhaps the most sort of obvious application that one could study with this framework. And in particular, there we think about the optimal design of spectrum licenses in these spectrum license options, where the FCC has very carefully thought about these trade-offs between providing investment incentives and allowing for ease of efficient reallocation in the event that there's, say, technological progress in the economy. We also look at renting, regulation of private rental markets, and then we think about policies such as rent control. We look at optimal procurement, and there we show that our framework can provide a foundation for advanced market commitments, which have also been a topic that's been very sort of popular recently in light of the sort of recent pandemic and the desire of a lot of governments to incentivize the development of vaccines. We look at patent policy, and then the last thing we do is look at supply chain contracting and particularly study the ratchet effect in supply chain contracting. So just to wrap up, what this paper does is it introduces this simple but very flexible framework for analyzing the optimal design of property rights. And what we show is that the one way to think about optimally designed rights is basically in terms of partially restoring commitment to future trading mechanisms. And the optimal right is going to often feature this option to own contract, which are a form of contracts that have received a lot of attention sort of previously in the literature on property rights, because we see them very often used in practice. And to the best of our knowledge, this is the first paper that provides a optimality foundation for these contracts in a much broader class of possible property rights. And I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much.